Okay, stop what you're doing for a second, because I need you to understand something before we even start this video. What I'm about to tell you, this is not analysis, this is not opinion, this is not me predicting what might happen, this is what is happening right now, today, April 14th, 2026. And if you understand this story fully, if you really understand every layer of it, you will never look at American power, Chinese strategy, or Middle East geopolitics the same way again. So, let's go from the very beginning, because you cannot understand today without understanding February 28th, 2026, the day everything changed. On the morning of February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive, coordinated military campaign against Iran. Not a warning strike, not a limited operation, a full-scale air war. American B-2 stealth bombers, cruise missiles, and fighter jets hit more than 13,000 targets inside Iran over the following 40 days. Missile factories, weapons warehouses, drone manufacturing plants, air defense systems, nuclear facilities, including the deeply buried Natanz enrichment site, struck with bunker-buster bombs specifically designed to penetrate deep underground. And on the very first day, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was assassinated, gone. The man who had led the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, killed. Ali Larijani, Iran's chief security official, one of its most experienced negotiators, the man who had been the bridge between Tehran and the world, also killed on the first day. By the time the initial wave of strikes was over, the U.S. military's own internal assessment described Iran's defense industrial base as, and I'm quoting directly, completely destroyed. Roughly 80% of Iran's nuclear infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed. Its air defenses, gone. Its missile storage infrastructure, gone. Now here's the question you have to ask. What do you do when your military is gone? When your supreme leader is dead? When your negotiators are killed? When you cannot fight back equally? Iran did the one thing it could still do. The one move that didn't require missiles or aircraft or soldiers. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. And I need you to sit with that for a moment. Because a lot of people hear Strait of Hormuz in the news and it doesn't land the way it should. So let me be very specific. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel of water, only about 33 kilometers wide at its most narrow point, sitting between Iran and Oman at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Before this war began, roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply passed through that channel every single day. Saudi Arabian oil, Iraqi oil, Kuwaiti oil, oil from the United Arab Emirates, oil from Qatar, all of it loaded onto massive tankers passing through that 33-kilometer gap and shipped out to the rest of the world. When Iran closed it, when Iranian ships started blocking traffic, when mines were planted throughout the waterway, the global economy felt it within hours. Oil prices jumped from roughly $70 per barrel before the conflict to a peak of 120 cents per barrel. That is nearly double. Fuel prices shot up at gas stations across Europe, Asia, and America. Food prices followed because food doesn't just grow, it has to be transported, and transportation runs on fuel. Factories in Germany, South Korea, Japan, and India slowed their production because they depend on Gulf energy. And ordinary people, in countries that had absolutely nothing to do with this war, in countries that couldn't find Iran on a map, they felt the pain directly, at the pump, at the grocery store, in their electricity bills. That is the weight of the Strait of Hormuz. That is why it matters. That is why everything in this story revolves around that 33-kilometer gap of water. The first weeks, war, sanctions, and a world on edge. For the first weeks of the war, the United States maintained an extraordinary level of military pressure. Trump repeatedly threatened to destroy Iran's infrastructure entirely if Tehran did not make a deal. On March 6, Trump wrote publicly, "There will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender." On March 9th, he claimed, falsely as it turned out, that the war is very complete pretty much, and that Iran's military had been destroyed and the Strait of Hormuz had reopened. It had not. The strait remained effectively closed. Iranian ships had planted sea mines throughout the waterway. Ships were avoiding it. Global tanker traffic through Hormuz had ground to a near halt. Meanwhile, the United States Treasury was under its own pressure. The U.S. was spending billions of dollars per week sustaining the military campaign. Global oil markets were in chaos. American gasoline prices were climbing. Allies in Europe were furious. The European Union's fuel import bill had already risen by more than $25 billion since the war began. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated publicly that the disruption of energy supplies would continue for some time to come. By late March, something was shifting. Iran, its military devastated, its leadership decimated, its economy collapsing under renewed sanctions and the loss of oil revenue, was beginning to signal quietly that it might be willing to talk. And someone needed to make that conversation happen. Someone trusted by both sides. Someone with no military bases hosting American troops. Someone with deep ties to both Washington and Tehran. That someone was Pakistan. Pakistan's extraordinary moment. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Asim Munir had been working behind the scenes for weeks, passing messages between Washington and Tehran, building trust, creating a channel between two governments that had not had direct high-level contact since 1979. On March 31st, Pakistan delivered what it called a 5-point initiative for peace, calling for an immediate end to all hostilities and the allowance of humanitarian aid into the region. And then, on April 7th and 8th, 2026, it happened. After weeks of painstaking back-channel diplomacy, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, brokered by Pakistan. Iran agreed to allow shipping through the Strait of Hormuz during the ceasefire period. Trump announced it on Truth Social. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed it. The world exhaled. For the first time in 40 days, there was a pause in the strikes. Tanker traffic began to cautiously resume in the strait. Oil prices came down slightly from their peak. Stock markets rallied. The S&P 500 actually erased all of its losses since the war began on the day the ceasefire was announced, closing up more than 1%. But, and this is critical, the ceasefire was fragile from the very first hour. J.D. Vance, Trump's own vice president, called it a fragile truce. And he was right. Israel, which had its own separate war continuing in Lebanon against Hezbollah, was not fully included in the ceasefire terms. Iran kept demanding that the Lebanon front be covered. It wasn't. Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon continued. Hezbollah kept firing back. And the Strait of Hormuz, Iran never fully reopened it. Iranian ships had planted sea mines throughout the waterway, and according to multiple reports, Iran had actually lost track of where some of those mines were. It literally could not fully open the strait even if it wanted to. The U.S. Navy had to begin its own mine-clearing operations just to allow ships to transit safely. Despite all of this, the ceasefire was supposed to be the foundation, the starting point, the foundation on which real permanent peace negotiations could be built. And so, both sides agreed to meet. Islamabad, the 21 hours that failed to save the world on April 11, 2026, the most significant diplomatic meeting since the 1979 Iranian Revolution took place. Not in Geneva, not in Vienna, not in Washington or London or Paris, in Islamabad, Pakistan, a relatively quiet, purpose-built capital city that was suddenly, surreally, the center of the world. The American delegation was led by Vice President J.D. Vance. Alongside him, Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and longtime Middle East advisor. 300 members on the U.S. team. The Iranian delegation was led by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a former military commander and one of Iran's most hardline senior officials, alongside Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. 70 members on the Iranian side. The location was the Serena Hotel in Islamabad, a sprawling, elegant oasis with lawns, banquet halls, a sushi restaurant, and a rooftop pool. The hotel was locked down completely. Over 10,000 security personnel were deployed across the city. Roads were sealed. Checkpoints appeared overnight. The Iranian delegation had arrived late on Friday night, their movement swift and largely unseen. Their aircraft had flown with transponders switched off, escorted by Pakistani Air Force jets through Pakistani airspace. Even many Pakistanis said it was surreal. World peace being decided in their city. The talks began on Saturday, April 11th, and ran through the night. 3 rounds. The first round was indirect, meaning American and Iranian negotiators were in separate rooms with Pakistani mediators carrying messages between them. The second and third rounds were face-to-face, direct, historic, the highest-level meeting between the United States and Iran since the Islamic Revolution 47 years ago. They talked for 21 hours, and on Sunday morning, April 12th, J.D. Vance walked out of the Serena Hotel, faced the cameras, and said, "The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. They have chosen not to accept our terms." He was weary. He called it the best final offer the U.S. had made, and he got on Air Force Two and left. So what happened inside those 21 hours? Why did it fail? The issues were deep and fundamental. The United States came to Islamabad with several non-negotiable demands. First, Iran must completely end all uranium enrichment, not reduce it, not limit it, end it entirely. Second, Iran must dismantle all of its major uranium enrichment facilities. Third, Iran's existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium must be physically removed from Iranian soil. Fourth, Iran must commit to permanently stopping its funding and support of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, the proxy groups through which Tehran has projected power across the region for decades. Fifth, Iran must fully open the Strait of Hormuz and stop charging ships any fees for passing through. On that last point, let me give you the scale of what Iran was charging. Iranian officials were demanding up to $2 million per ship for transit through the strait. A retired U.S. Admiral, James Fago, told NPR, "If you take 100 ships per day crossing the strait and multiply by 365 days a year, that's $73 billion a year." His words, "That's more than the U.S. Navy got for its shipbuilding budget." Iran was not going to give that revenue stream up easily. Iran's chief negotiator, Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, posted on X after leaving Islamabad, "The U.S. has understood Iran's logic and principles, and it's time for them to decide whether they can earn our trust or not." Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said the talks ended with gaps between the sides on several major issues. Iran's ambassador to Pakistan said the atmosphere had been dignified and calm, but dignified and calm is not the same as successful. Trump watched from Washington. He told Fox News, "It was a really good meeting, except for one issue. They want to have nuclear weapons. It's not going to happen." And then Trump did what he had been holding in reserve for weeks. He played his final card. The blockade, Trump's maximum pressure move. On Sunday, April 12th, immediately after Vance left Islamabad, Trump announced a full naval blockade of Iran. U.S. Central Command issued the formal order. The blockade would begin Monday, April 13th, 2026 at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. It would target all vessels of all nations entering or exiting Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea east of the Strait of Hormuz. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Center issued a separate notice confirming the enforcement. Trump said any vessel that had paid Iran's illegal toll to cross the strait would be, his word, eliminated. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps responded immediately. Any military vessel approaching the Strait of Hormuz under any pretext, they warned, would be considered a ceasefire violation and would face a severe response. Iran's parliament speaker from Islamabad posted on X, "Enjoy the current pump figures. With the so-called blockade, soon you'll be nostalgic for $4 to $5 gas." Iran's foreign ministry called the blockade a direct threat to global trade with wide-ranging consequences. Iranian President Pezeshkian said Trump's military threats were ineffective and that Iran prefers diplomacy. Legal experts across the world immediately flagged the fundamental problem with what Trump was attempting. Under international law, specifically the rules governing international straits, as laid out in the San Remo Manual on International Law Applicable in Armed Conflicts at Sea, the United States has no legal authority to close, suspend, or impede transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is an international waterway. Only Iran and Oman are its coastal states, and even they are prohibited under international maritime law from suspending transit passage. Retired Admiral James Fago was blunt on NPR. Technically speaking, a blockade of a country's ability to export goods and services is an act of war. Experts and former Pentagon officials told Reuters that enforcing a naval blockade of this geographic scope is an expensive and potentially long-lasting military undertaking, and international law is clear. A paper blockade, a proclamation without adequate force to actually stop every vessel, is not legally valid. You have to actually stop the ships, every ship. But the blockade went into effect at 10 a.m. on Monday, April 13th. The announcement was made, the U.S. Navy was in position, and the world waited to see how tight this blockade would actually be. China, the country that was always at the center of this. To understand what happened next, you need to understand China's position in this entire conflict. Because China is not a peripheral player here. China is not a distant observer commenting from the sidelines. China is at the economic heart of this entire story. China imports roughly 50% of its crude oil from the Persian Gulf region. Let that number sit with you. Half of China's oil, for its 1.4 billion people, for its factories, for its entire economic engine, comes from the Persian Gulf, and within that, about 10% of China's total oil imports come directly from Iran, typically transshipped through third countries to avoid U.S. sanctions. China is, by a significant margin, Iran's largest oil buyer. Beijing has been watching this war from the beginning with deep concern. When the Strait of Hormuz closed in late February, China felt it economically within days. When oil prices hit $126 a barrel, Chinese factories saw their energy costs explode. When Iran and the U.S. negotiated the ceasefire in early April, China was quietly involved. White House press secretary confirmed Chinese involvement in the ceasefire negotiations. When the Islamabad talks collapsed and Trump announced the blockade, Beijing responded swiftly and strongly. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the ceasefire very fragile on April 13th. He spoke by phone with Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar and urged the global community to unequivocally oppose any actions that undermine the ceasefire or escalate the confrontation. He met separately with the UAE's special envoy to China and told him directly that the U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz does not serve the common interests of the international community. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian called the U.S. blockade, publicly, directly, dangerous and irresponsible, saying it will only escalate tensions between the U.S. and Iran. Another foreign ministry spokesperson, Guo Jiakun, said the blockade risked undermining an already fragile ceasefire situation and called on all parties to restore normal traffic in the strait as soon as possible. President Xi Jinping, speaking in a broader context, said the world must not be allowed to revert to the law of the jungle. Strong language. Unprecedented in its directness from Beijing. But words, even strong words from the foreign ministry of the world's second-largest economy, do not physically break a naval blockade. What breaks a blockade is a ship. The rich Starry, the ship that changed the story. On the night of Monday, April 13th, into the early hours of Tuesday, April 14th, 2026, the first night of Trump's declared blockade of Iran, a medium-range chemical tanker named the Rich Starry departed from Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. It entered the Strait of Hormuz. It transited through. It continued on its course. Destination, China. Marine traffic ship tracking data confirmed the passage. It was the first vessel to pass through the waterway since Trump had announced the total blockade. And here is the detail that makes this so significant. The Rich Starry and its Chinese owner, Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping, were sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department back in 2018, specifically for dealings with Iran. This is not a neutral vessel. This is not a ship the U.S. had overlooked. This is a vessel the United States government had specifically named and sanctioned, and it sailed through on the first night. Then came a second vessel. The Elpis, registered in Comoros, also passed through the Strait of Hormuz. The Elpis had been sanctioned by the United States in 2025 specifically for its involvement in the sale, purchase, and transportation of Iranian petroleum as part of what the U.S. itself calls Iran's shadow fleet, ships that use tactics like turning off their tracking transponders to move oil in defiance of American sanctions. 2 sanctioned ships, first night, through the blockade. The CEO of Anglo-Eastern, one of the world's largest ship management companies, said it plainly. I would be careful not to interpret the blockade too literally as a physical interdiction at the strait itself. Data intelligence company Kepler confirmed the transits. The blockade had been breached before it was 24 hours old. What China just did, and why it was genius. Now I want you to really think about what just happened, because the headline says China broke the blockade. But the depth of what China did goes far beyond one tanker sailing through a strait. China did not send a warship. China did not issue a military challenge to the U.S. Navy. China did not announce that it was defying the blockade. China did not make any aggressive statement. Beijing simply allowed a sanctioned tanker to do what it had been doing all along: move oil, sail to China, continue business as usual. No shots, no soldiers, no warships, no escalation, just commerce. And in doing so, China sent a message to the entire world that is louder than any military statement could be. The blockade is not airtight. Countries that depend on Iranian oil do not have to stop buying it, because the enforcement of this blockade against sanctioned Chinese tankers carrying oil to the world's second-largest economy is not as absolute as Trump announced. And now Washington faces the most difficult dilemma of this entire conflict. If the U.S. Navy physically stops a Chinese tanker, a vessel carrying cargo to China, operated by a Chinese company, Trump is not just fighting Iran anymore. He is confronting Beijing. He is starting a military-economic confrontation with the world's second-largest economy at a moment when the U.S. and China are already locked in tariff wars, when Trump has a planned visit to China coming next month, when the U.S. military is already stretched across the Middle East, when global markets are already fragile at $99 oil, and when the IMF is warning of a potential global recession. Trump himself had already drawn a red line this week. He threatened to impose an additional 50% tariff on China if Beijing supplies Iran with advanced air defense systems. 3 U.S. intelligence sources told CNN that Beijing was preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran within the next few weeks. China's embassy denied it, saying China has never provided weapons to any party to the conflict. But the threat is on the table. The pressure is building from multiple directions simultaneously. Trita Parsi, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, told CNBC directly, "I doubt Trump is ready for that escalation." He added that it wouldn't be surprising if Trump ultimately walks back on some of his earlier blockade threats. The CEO of Anglo-Eastern put it another way. Enforcement is expected to be straightforward for outbound Iranian vessels, but more complex for inbound vessels and for those operating under deceptive conditions. In other words, stopping Iranian oil from leaving is one thing. Stopping Chinese ships from picking it up, that is a different category of confrontation entirely. The global economy is already screaming. While all of this is happening, the economic damage is real and it is accelerating. The International Monetary Fund, in its updated World Economic Outlook published this week, said the global economy is facing a major test. It projects global growth will slow to 3.1% in 2026 and 3.2% in 2027 if the conflict stays limited in scope and duration. But the IMF was explicit: downside risks dominate. A longer or broader conflict, combined with worsening geopolitical fragmentation and renewed trade tensions, could slow global growth to 2.5%, or even 2%. Economists define 2% or below as essentially a global recession. The IMF's managing director said flatly that the progress of the first months of the year has been wiped out. The European Union's fuel import bill has risen by more than $25 billion in just 44 days of this conflict. EU Commission President von der Leyen advised EU governments to immediately start coordinating their use of oil and natural gas stocks, and proposed relaxing state aid rules to help countries cope with the energy shock. U.S. crude oil is trading at approximately $99 per barrel as of today. Before the war began, it was $70. That is a 41% increase. And Iran's parliament speaker, Ghalibaf, who just left the failed Islamabad talks, posted his warning on X that Americans would soon be nostalgic for $4 to $5 gas. He was speaking to an American audience. He was saying, "You think $99 oil is bad? Wait until this blockade creates the next shock." He called Trump's move the so-called blockade, signaling that Iran does not believe it will hold. Where things stand right now, April 14, 2026. So here is the situation as of today. The U.S. naval blockade of Iran is officially in effect. But on its very first night, 2 sanctioned tankers, one Chinese, one part of Iran's shadow fleet, transited the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade is not airtight. U.S. officials are quietly discussing the possibility of a second round of talks with Iran, possibly back in Islamabad later this week. The ceasefire officially expires on April 22, 2026. That is 8 days away. Pakistan, which brokered the original ceasefire and hosted the Islamabad talks, has described the process as an Islamabad process, framing it as an ongoing diplomatic track, not a failed one-time meeting. Pakistan remains in contact with both Washington and Tehran. France's President Emmanuel Macron has announced preparations for what he calls a peaceful multinational mission aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. He plans to convene a conference with Britain in the coming days to organize this mission. This is significant. It means even America's European allies are preparing contingency plans that are separate from and potentially in tension with Washington's approach. Israel and Lebanon are holding direct talks in Washington today, their first in decades. Hezbollah has rejected any agreement and vowed not to abide by any terms. The Lebanon front remains explosive. China continues to call for ceasefire and dialogue through its foreign ministry, and its tankers continue to sail. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope in history, has publicly condemned Trump's approach to Iran. Trump responded at the White House by saying the Pope said things that are wrong and is very weak on crime, adding, Pope Leo would not be happy with the end result. It is an extraordinary moment. The American president publicly feuding with the American Pope over an American war. The lesson. What this moment actually means. I want to end this video with something important, because I think people will watch the headline, China broke the blockade overnight, and think this is a story about one tanker. It is not. This is a story about the nature of power in the 21st century. In the 20th century, power was military. It was nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers and the ability to destroy armies. And military power still matters, enormously. The United States proving in February 2026 that it can bomb 13,000 targets and eliminate a country's military infrastructure in 40 days, that matters. That is real power. But here is what China just demonstrated. In the modern, deeply interconnected global economy, economic interdependence is also power. The fact that China buys half its oil from the Persian Gulf, the fact that China is Iran's largest oil customer, the fact that stopping Chinese tankers means confronting the world's second largest economy at a moment of maximum instability. That is leverage. That is power. And Beijing used it without firing a single shot. China didn't need to break the blockade dramatically. It just needed to keep buying oil. It just needed to let commerce continue. It just needed to make Washington calculate the cost of stopping a Chinese-flagged, Chinese-sanctioned vessel in the middle of an already explosive situation. And that calculation, the cost of confronting China on top of fighting Iran, on top of tariff wars, on top of a potential global recession, that is what is making this blockade a paper blockade in its opening hours. Trump spent weeks building this blockade. He spent weeks preparing the diplomatic ground, the military positioning, the public announcements. He used it as his maximum pressure card after the Islamabad talks collapsed. He called it total, he called it historic, and China broke it overnight without firing a single shot, without a single warship, without a single soldier, just a tanker sailing to China. The ceasefire expires in 8 days. Watch what happens next.